Good evening, everybody, and good morning to you, Professor Kentaro. The time difference is here. So, we are already introduced to each other, but I have this responsibility of formally introducing you to everybody. So, Professor Kentaro Toyama is W.K. Kellogg Professor of Community Information at the University of Michigan School of Information, a fellow of the Dalai Lama Center for Ethics and Transformative Values at MIT at the same time. He has authored the book Geek Hersey and Rescuing Social Change from the Cult of Technology. So he has actually worked at many places post his PhD from Yale University. He started his career as a researcher in 2000 from Microsoft Research, Cambridge. He also has an association with India. He was a visiting scientist at the Indian Institute of Science from 2005 to 2009. And he has many awards and publications to his credit. So welcome, Professor Kentaro Toyama, and thanks for agreeing to deliver a talk for Management Center for Human Values at IIM Calcutta. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you so much, and thanks to Professors Nisigandha and Ramendra for inviting me. Yes, I actually lived and worked in Bangalore for a little over 5 years. I helped Microsoft start a new research lab there, and then stayed to continue doing some research. And a lot of what I will be talking about today will be based on things that I learned through that experience, although I won't say too much about the work that I did there. So hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes.
Great. As you saw in the title, I'll be talking about needs and aspirations, and specifically in the context of human development, which is also called global development or international development or rural development. You know, basically the work that contributes to socio-economic growth of poorer communities. But I think a lot of what I'm going to say will apply to other contexts, including business, and also to other situations, whether they're within our families or with other types of institutions. So to begin, these are various excerpts from different documents that are talking about the goals of international development. And you'll see that there's several that are from the 1970s. That was the decade when this idea of basic needs being a critical element of development was formalized, initially by the International Labor Organization, which you see in the middle, and then later on more and more kind of international development organizations piled on, and many governments as well. The idea is very simple, which is that when we're trying to think about improving the socioeconomic conditions of very low-income communities, that one of the most important things is that they should have all of their basic needs met. They should have food, water, shelter, clothing, and then a range of public services like healthcare and education. And even though this was an idea that was formulated in the 70s, I would say it has remained a very powerful element of international development. So if you look at the bottom left corner, there is a quote from the United Nations talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, which followed on to the Millennium Development Goals in 2015. And the first SDG out of, I think about, it's 19 of them, but the first SDG is specifically about poverty alleviation. And again, they talk once again about basic needs like health, education, access to water and sanitation, and so forth. So in this talk, I'm going to be not so much contradicting the value of needs. I think it's important to, I think that there's a reason why basic needs have sustained for multiple decades as an important goal in international development, but also suggesting that conceptually it leads to some challenges in terms of how we think about development, how we think about social progress, and so forth. So I'm going to start with some stories that I have personally encountered. So this is a photograph I took in Jhansi in Madhya Pradesh in India. I was there to visit some computer kiosk projects that were taking place in the rural areas. But my host was this man in the middle. His name is AVM Sani. He used to be, I think, he was like a lieutenant in the Indian Air Force. But in his retirement, he turned towards rural development. And so he was kind of leading the effort in this area. And one of the things he was most excited about was something called check dams. Basically, a lot of the fresh drinkable water in India ends up flowing into the ocean. And so, there's a question as to how you can slow down that flow so that more of it can be used for agriculture and for drinking purposes and so on. And what check dams are is basically they're just, long concrete structures that you build across a river, just enough so that the water doesn't stop, but it slows down the flow. And what happens is that the communities that are above the check dam, that are upstream of the check dam, basically their soil is suddenly infused with a lot of water, and so it becomes much more fertile. And this community, what he was able to do was to get this farming community that he's talking to go from just one harvest of wheat each year to 2 harvests of wheat simply by building a check dam near their village. And one of the stories he told me was that he thought that if they adjusted their planting and harvesting schedule a little bit, that they could actually get in 3 harvests of wheat every year. So effectively, he would, that they would be able to go from less than $1 a day of income. They had recently just doubled it, and now they would be able to triple it. And what he told me with a, kind of with a smile was that when he tried to convince the local farmers to take on a 3rd harvest per year, they started to complain. They said, who's this old man who has nothing better to do than go from village to village trying to make us do more work? And I thought that, he was very cognizant of this, this funny way that people responded, because, to anybody outside of these communities, we would think, these are very poor communities. They barely make enough to survive under 1 harvest a year, and 2 doubles their income, but it's still not much. Why wouldn't they want to triple their income? And, but from their perspective, they had just doubled their income. And now they had a lot more, income than they had ever had in their lives before. They didn't see the need to work extra hard to triple their income. And so, this story for me just reminds you how much, what we think of as poverty and what we think of as a reasonable income depends on what you're used to, and it's very different from community to community. Another issue, of course, in rural development especially is sanitation. And there have been multiple attempts, as probably some of you know, in India to kind of increase toilets and the use of toilets and so on. And one of the things that persistently comes out is that despite the fact that from a health perspective and a sanitation perspective, toilets are without doubt superior to just going outside in the woods. But again, people, efforts to do this through a range of government agencies as well as NGOs routinely finds that in many communities there's a lot of resistance. I've seen buildings like this that were meant to be built toilets being used for things like housing, grain. Oftentimes they're just completely unused and inoperable. And so the question is, why wouldn't people want to do something that is, in theory, better for their health? We think that people need sanitation, but in fact, people don't necessarily use it when we provide the means to have a more sanitary environment. And then a third story. So this is a story that I heard from a man named Kevin Bales, who is international rights activist who works against slavery worldwide. Now, in most countries, there are laws against slavery, but in reality, slavery still exists in various forms, often as indentured servitude where somebody's in debt. And a story that he related, it goes like this. So he was speaking to 2 people, husband and wife, who were basically indentured servants. They, in order to live, they were required to work for a family that owned the farm. And this is their story. After my wife received this money, we paid off our debt and were free to do whatever we wanted. But I was worried all the time. What if one of the children got sick? What if our crop failed? What if the government wanted some money? Since we no longer belong to the landlord, we didn't get food every day as before. Finally, I went to the landlord and asked him to take me back. I didn't have to borrow any money, but he agreed to let me be his halvaha again. Now I don't worry so much. I know what to do. So this is a shocking kind of situation. They inherited money to release themselves from virtual slavery, and then they became so insecure about how they would earn a living that basically they asked to be taken back into a modern form of slavery. So in all of these things, the question is, is there a need here, and why is it that a community that appears to need it refuses to take it? So, more income, sanitation, and even kind of freedom of a very basic kind. And so what I'm going to ask is, why do we keep focusing on needs? And is there an alternative to needs that might help us look for something that allows us to align more with what people really believe they want for themselves? So in a range of social sciences, this idea of needs has been articulated, and in very different ways. In social work, people talk about needs all the time in terms of, okay, it's very similar to the basic needs framework of development. In psychology, a range of psychologists, starting with Freud, thought about human beings having needs and meeting those needs as being a great motivator for almost all of our activity. In fields like educational technology, there was this idea of a needs assessment that is, I would say, conducted now in many, many different fields. I'm at a school of information where we often teach students who want to go into the technology industry to understand how to design digital technologies. And we teach, in fact, I teach a course on needs assessment. And so in all of these, the phrase needs, the word needs comes in. And needs is also a significant part of the discipline of design. So Don Norman is a very well-known designer. He wrote this book, The Design of Everyday Things. And this is the way he articulates. He says, good design puts human needs, capabilities, and behaviors first, and then designs to accommodate those needs, capabilities, and ways of behaving. We have to accept human behavior the way it is, not the way we would wish it to be. And to me, this is a really interesting statement. He's basically saying that if you're in the business of design, you should not be trying to change people, right? We have to accept human behavior the way it is, not the way we wish it to be. And our goal as designers would be to meet the needs that people have and nothing else. Now, I was interested in kind of really going into why we focus on needs so much, and I went to the dictionary definition, and in the dictionary it's defined as a need is defined as a necessity or requirement, and then sometimes it's defined in this way: violence, force, constraint, or compulsion exercised upon a person. And if you think about basic needs, that's what they are, right? Like if you don't have food and you need food, it's quite a violent situation that you're in. Physical pain is involved. But also because of that, there's a range of reasons, I think, why needs are not necessarily an ideal focus. One is, again, that they're both motivated by very negative feelings like hunger, thirst, pain, and so on. Oftentimes, needs are very intense, but only fleetingly experienced. So if you meet the need, then you no longer feel the need, right? And this is a cycle that all of us go through, right? When we're hungry, we eat, but then as soon as we're satisfied, we're done, and that need disappears. And then, as the examples that I showed in the last few slides show, what we think of as needs, what one person thinks of as needs are not always felt as needs by other people. And so it's very easy to project needs onto other groups. And there's research that suggests that when you ask about people's needs, they try to second guess the person who's asking. They're trying to figure out, some way to tell them what they want to hear rather than actually explaining the desires that they really have. And then finally, I think, especially in a development context, needs elicits a certain kind of behavior, which is to give the thing that's needed to the other person, which, of course, again, in emergency situations is very important, but it might not be a good, long-lasting, long-term solution. And I think in the case of business context, when you talk about needs, certainly if you can provide a product that meets the needs, that's great from a business perspective, but it may not fundamentally lead to any improvement in society beyond that exchange. So the main question I want to ask is there an alternative to focusing on needs? And there's this phrase, needs and aspirations, which at least according to Google Books, appears to have started, sometime in the early 19th century, in the early 1800s, and then over time has been used more and more and more. And people talk about, needs and aspirations almost as a single phrase. But what's interesting to me is the fact that we have to say both needs and aspirations suggests that they're two different things, in fact. And so, what is it that, what are aspirations and how are they different from needs? And that's the question I'm going to ask in the next few slides. Academics, of course, have thought about aspirations quite a bit. In sociology and psychology, it's often related to a person's career aspirations. So people say, I have an aspiration to become a doctor, or I have an aspiration to become a lawyer. And there's a lot of research that is about career aspirations. I personally feel that that kind of aspiration is certainly one aspect of aspiration, but it's kind of too narrowly defined. Like, a lot of people have aspirations that have nothing to do with their work, professional life, but they may have something to do with their personal life or with their spiritual life. Another form of aspiration is about level of achievement, and this is often relevant to students. They have an aspiration to finish college or to go to business school and things like that. Another kind of aspiration are, is evident in the phrase aspirational consumption. So people, have an aspiration to demonstrate something about themselves by, owning certain products, right? So this is, this was very visible, I would say in the last 15 years or so, when people started, designing smartphones rather than, regular phones that could only do voice and SMS. And so there was an aspiration, not just among people who could easily afford it, but even among relatively poor groups to want to have a sign of what looked like solid middle class status. And then there's other definitions of aspiration. Apadurai is an anthropologist. He has this idea that the capacity to aspire is something that you want to increase and focus. And so then finally, in economics, people think of aspirations as a bound on desires. In other words, the aspiration is the ceiling of how much you might desire in a different context. And I find all of these definitions are, to tell part of the story, but they're not really the full sense of aspirations that I feel like, we understand when we think of an aspiration. In fact, I noticed on the center website that in the first the word aspiration occurs, and I would say none of these quite capture that sense of aspiration. And so again, I'm going back to the dictionary, and if you look at multiple dictionaries, they're fairly consistent, at least in English, what an aspiration is. And I'm going to pull out some of the elements in these dictionary definitions. So the first is that an aspiration is some kind of desire. Right, so it's a desire or longing, a strong desire, an ardent wish or desire. So an aspiration is a kind of desire. It's not all desires, but it's a kind of desire. And then the other aspect of aspiration is that it is often persistent. It sustains over time. So usually we don't think of aspirations as something where I have an aspiration today and tomorrow it's met and then the aspiration is done. We think of something that kind of exists with us over multiple years, possible decades, possible even over an entire lifetime. And then finally, an aspiration is a desire that is kind of upward focused, right? It's not like, for example, some of us may have a desire for, you may have a desire to eat food that is not nutritionally good for you, but nobody says that they have an aspiration to, eat more French fries or eat more potato chips, right? That's not the kind of desire. An aspiration, as again, in these dictionary definitions, is something, aiming for something above one, aiming for something higher, great, what is elevated or spiritual. And so to me, these three characteristics really represent what an aspiration is. It's a desire, but it's different from other kinds of desires in that it is both persistent and it tends to aim for something higher. In contrast to needs, here are some of the differences. Needs, I think, are also a certain kind of desire, right? So again, if you're hungry or thirsty, that's definitely a desire. But again, needs are often motivated by negative feelings, right? They're motivated by pain or the fear of pain, whereas aspirations are often aimed at, again, this desire to improve, your life in some way, aimed at some kind of positive life change. Needs, again, are fleeting. Once you meet them, they're gone. Aspirations, I think, are a little bit longer lasting. I'll say in the next few slides how I do think aspirations do evolve over time, but they still change very slowly in the course of a lifetime. And then finally, needs are relatively easy to project from the outside. We imagine that our needs are the same as other people's needs, and it's very easy to say, hey, look, this community needs this, whatever else they may think. Whereas aspirations are really, I think it's easier to recognize that they are person dependent or community dependent. And so we are more likely to engage with them and try to understand the other person's aspiration. The second conjecture I have this, and I'll say by the way that almost everything I presented in this talk is all conjecture. I don't have hard evidence that proves any of this, but I'm certainly still interested in trying to do some research to see if these things can be made more real. And one effort towards that end is that I believe it is possible to ask people about their aspirations. And when I first started thinking about this, it's already been over a decade ago, I started thinking about how I could ask people about their aspirations. And one of the big challenges is that aspiration itself is a word that's not easy to translate. I tried it just, even into Japanese, which is, my first language. There's no exact word that I feel captures this idea in English. And so, sorry. One question is, how can this be consistently phrased in such a way that we can ask people about their aspirations? And this is the phrasing that I came to after several years of trying this with different people, including colleagues, but also people I interacted with through research. And that phrase is, among those things which you have some control over, what would you most like to change about yourself or your life over the next 5 years? And if this is something you can translate into any language, and in most cases, it appears to get at what I would think of as a personal aspiration. And I tried this. I inserted this question in a sample survey in Kenya, which basically was a survey that a particular survey company ran for over 2,000 people every few months in Kenya. And I got nearly 1,800 responses back. And here are some of the sample responses on the left-hand side: to advance my education so I can earn a well-paying job, to live in a better place, to start a business, to have children and provide for them, to do more community service. And I think you can see that these are all, again, desires. They're things that are reasonably persistent, right? You can see multi-year kind of persistence. And then they're all aiming for something, better, right? They're all aiming for something positive. A research assistant and I coded all 1,800 of the responses that we got, and we were able to basically put them into 7 rough categories. So, aspirations to increase income, to own a business, to improve standard of living, to obtain more education, to grow or strengthen one's family, to serve others, or to improve oneself. And, again, all of these are they fit the definition of an aspiration. They're positive and they're enduring and there's some kind of desire. And I also think it's really significant that by asking this kind of question, out of the 1,800 responses, we didn't get a single instance of somebody suggesting something that you might perceive as morally negative. And that's not to say that there might not be people in that population that aren't doing things that are questionable, right? I mean, there could be people involved in local gangs or local mafia type activities, but even they don't think about what they're doing in terms of they think about it in terms of these kinds of 7 different positive things, right? So even if you're, let's say, a crime boss, you're not thinking I'm doing these things because I want to be evil. I'm doing them because I want to provide for my family or because I want to do something better for the community. And so I think this is a reasonable suggestion that you can, in fact, ask people about their aspirations and get responses that make sense. And then the third conjecture I have about aspirations is that, and this is really the main thesis of this talk, is that they're better than needs as a motive force for human development and social change. And this is for some of the reasons I've already been saying. One is that they're focused on optimistic emotions, and I think in general those are, if not stronger motivators, they're more persistent motivators, and they're easier to connect with. The other thing is that because aspirations are longer term, I think they're more effective as a way to cause social change. So most forms of social change, whether it's education or political empowerment or let's say gender equality, require people to make a lot of internal effort over time. And if you don't have something persistent nudging you in that direction, it's very difficult to get people to continue to make make the efforts that they need to. And so something persistent is required, and I think aspirations fits the bill. Another point I'll point out is that, again, unlike needs, I think aspirations tends to cause people who want to help, puts them in a different mindset. So instead of just giving people things, it causes you to think more in terms of how can I help you achieve the aspiration that you have for yourself, so that you become the kind of person who can achieve that aspiration. And then finally, one thing that I think is really important for international development is that we often think of international development as being just for people who are poor. And we imagine that, once we get them to a certain point, we're done. But I think a lot of the world's problems are actually problems of people who are actually wealthy and powerful. And what we need is for them to become better human beings. And I think the interesting thing about aspirations is that people who are wealthy and powerful still also have aspirations, and many of them start having aspirations towards wanting to contribute to society, or wanting to, give back to society, or wanting to, improve the way that they do their work. And so aspirations potentially allows a framework where everybody is on the scale, and we're all trying to, nudge ourselves forward. Now, I do think that aspirations doesn't solve everything. Needs certainly still need to be addressed. I mean, hunger and lack of nutrition is obvious, but even healthcare and education, I mean, these are real needs for, I think, a healthy society. And so even if people don't necessarily feel that they aspire towards these things, I think it's important that they be addressed. But I do think that refocusing our primary attention towards aspirations helps, and also doesn't eliminate needs as something we have to work on at the same time. I also am not claiming that design for the more traditional goals of design is unimportant. I mean, certainly I want the products that I use to be easy to use and to meet my needs. But I do think that there's also room to think about what people's aspirations are and how they plug into how we can think about social progress. I do think there's a lot of interesting challenges, both from a research perspective, also from implementation. As much as I do think you can ask about aspirations, I think it takes quite a bit of skill in terms of, either through interviews or through surveys to really ask about people's aspirations. And so better instruments for figuring them out need to be devised. Certainly there's a lot of subjective judgment in terms of, what an aspiration is, and, which ones are worth taking seriously. I think one of the bigger questions is, how do you navigate between individual aspirations and community aspirations? And this definitely happens at a national level, right? So, individuals may have aspirations that are very different from the aspirations of a whole community, but how do you get a community to express its aspirations? Is it enough to just ask the leaders? You have to have some kind of democratic process. And even if it's a democratic process, do you take the average aspiration, or do you take the mode of the aspiration? How do you kind of interpret community aspiration? I think those are very interesting questions. And then ultimately, there's questions around, how do you implement projects that are meant to support people's aspirations? And that's still a very open question. I'm going to end by providing a few examples of development projects that I think actually intentionally hooked into aspirations. I mentioned sanitation and the use of toilets. Again, as some of you may know, there have been multiple attempts by the governments of different states in India to increase the building and use of toilets, especially in poor communities that aren't used to using them. And again, the reasons are, of course, for health and sanitation. But as you saw before, there's often resistance. And there was an interesting program in Haryana called No Toilet, No Bride. And basically, it was a marketing campaign. And what they did was they would show these ads apparently on television in Haryana, where there was a mini story in which they talk a little bit about the fact that toilets are good for sanitation, but mostly they focus on the fact that a man who cannot provide a toilet for their wife is not a man who can, take care of the household, right? And so they turned it into this idea that, if you're interested in being able to provide for your family as a potential husband, then the obvious thing is to promise that you will, you will be able to build a house with a toilet in it. If I remember correctly, they also would have like celebrities talking about how they have toilets in their house. So why wouldn't everybody want to have such a thing? Again, what I think this, marketing campaign did was to hook into the aspirations of many poorer families to become middle class, right? And so instead of saying, look, you should install toilets because they're good for you, instead the message was, you should do them because they connect with your aspiration to be middle class family. There was I think there was a natural experiment that suggested that there was an increase as much as 10%, 11% in terms of the uptake of toilets. The second story is a project that that several of my colleagues and I worked on when I was in Bangalore with Microsoft Research, and some of my research associates had this idea that they wanted to see what would happen if we provided a computer terminal for completely free use for our kind of service staff, right? So this included the security staff, the custodial staff, the people who handled some of our electrical and plumbing issues, all of that. And basically, we put a computer connected to the internet, in a room and just let them use it whenever they wanted, as long as it didn't interfere with their work. Now, for most of the people, that meant they were using it to listen to music and to watch movies. But one of the security officers, it turned out, was taking data entry classes outside of work, and then he used this computer to practice those skills. And one day he came back and he said, I'm sorry to say that I'm quitting my job with you next month because I got a new job as a data entry professional. And you could tell he was just so proud, right? So, somebody who was in a solid blue collar job was suddenly able to find a white collar job. And I mean, it was interesting. He said, he told us that it meant an initial cut in pay because he was actually making, reasonable income as a senior security official, but he was much more proud of the fact that he would be doing this, white collar job. And what was interesting to us as researchers with this project was that, this hooked into a career aspiration that this person had. And without finding a way to take this computer project and connecting it to somebody's career aspiration, all it did was just provide more entertainment. And so after we heard from this person, we tried to find more ways to kind of use the computer in a way that would connect to people's other aspirations. Like, for example, a lot of people expressed wanting to learn English, and so we tried to provide software that helped them do that, and so on and so forth. So that's a second example. A third example, it has to do with an economics experiment that was overseen by a well-known economist, Rob Jensen. In this project, what he did was he was wondering whether you could increase the rate at which families took care of their girl children if you could prove to them that girls could be economically productive. And again, this is in villages around the Delhi area. And so what he did was he hired a recruiter who worked for a data entry company, a BPO, and he basically said, look, I would like to pay you to go to certain villages and see if you can hire women for the jobs that you're recruiting for anyway. And if you can, please hire 2 women per village. This man, went around and he found that, in fact, there were plenty of qualified women in these villages. And so he did exactly as he was directed. Rob Jensen did it in such a way that these villages were, it was basically a randomized control trial. So there were a bunch of villages, and he sampled half of them randomly for the recruiter to go to. And then the remarkable thing is this: 2 women per village got a job in the city, making very good income by village standards. What Jensen was able to find was that in the 2 years following that recruiting effort, he was able to measurably see more girls in school in those villages, and also that there was a less rate of stunting of girl children in those villages. So, so what happened? These villages, these are often very small communities where news gets around about, somebody suddenly getting a job in the city. So they had heard about some of their girl children getting very high income jobs in the city. And so they suddenly probably realized, hey, girls can be economically productive. And so the family started investing in the girls as much as they used to in the boys. And so this is a dramatic way in which I would say, the family's aspiration for a more economically secure future was effectively used in a way to cause an outcome that that is very hard to get to happen otherwise, right? In other words, if you just tell families, hey, you should make sure you treat your girl children as well as boy children, again, in these, more rural communities, they don't understand why, because, they're worried that their future is in the hands of, often their oldest boy. And if, why would they bother investing, any of that funding towards their girls? But if you show them that that kind of economic security can also come through their girl children, that they're much more willing to invest in the girls as well. So 3 different examples of how aspiration-focused development can work. Now, aspirations, I think, is a concept that's linked to different existing ideas in psychology as well as in political science. And I'll talk a little bit about these in the following way. So I'm very drawn to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is this, hierarchy of different human needs with physiological needs at the bottom, and then safety and security. And then there's a range, we often hear about self-actualization. And Maslow himself started thinking about something called self-transcendence, which I'm sure will be of interest to this community, which is this idea that, once you feel like you've accomplished everything for yourself, you want to do something that contributes to the world at large and to transcend your personal selfish needs. I think that hierarchy of needs can be kind of flipped around as a hierarchy of aspirations. Like, you can also see that people have different aspirations at each of these different levels in the hierarchy. And there are a range of both psychological, political science, and also sociological hierarchies that I think reflect this kind of individual level of growth, especially when you see it at the community level. So there's a psychological theory called Kohlberg's stages of moral development. In religion, there's stages of faith by Fowler. Ron Engelhardt is a political scientist who's been working to kind of understand mass values at a national scale around the world. And then there's Richard Florida, who has, who's famous for the creative class and so on. And I think even governments are often underwritten by a kind of a mass value of that society, right? Like, it's very difficult to have a really well-functioning democracy when people are concerned about things like, are they going to be able to eat? And they're much more willing to have a strong leader who's an autocrat than to have a democracy if they feel that some of their more physiological needs are met. And there's some evidence to suggest that this is in fact happening at a social scale. So on the left is a graph from Richard Florida from his book, The Creative Class. And this basically shows the percentage of the population in the United States that is engaged in different types of work over the decades. And you can see it starts from the early 1900s all the way through that century. And what you see is that farming and other kind of fishing, forestry types of industries declined very rapidly starting in the early 1900s in the United States. And since then, kind of work in factories and so on dominated. And then starting the middle of the century, there's an increase in service jobs, and then what Florida calls creative class jobs. And so I think what you're seeing is that as people's physiological needs are met, their professional aspirations are shifting more and more, higher and higher up Maslow's hierarchy. Ron Engelhardt has a similar kind of explanation for how he believes nations tend towards more and more democracy. And so again, as people's economic needs are met, then they want other things like the ability to express themselves freely, right? They want more political freedom. And as they want more of those things, they are more willing to support and activate towards forms of government that are less and less autocratic. And the way I think about this is that if you can understand the aspirational dynamics of an individual person, then of course, social processes are very complicated, but it gives you one basis to understand how society as a whole might evolve. I'm going to end by mentioning that, at least for my guess is that, many of us, here we have all heard from various people, whether it was from our parents or from our teachers, that we should all chase after our aspirations, that we should do what we love, that we should do what we, believe to be of interest to ourselves. And, arguably that is a very privileged kind of piece of advice, right? There are lots of people in the world who just don't have the option to follow their aspirations. They have to do work. They have to do work right away without going to, into higher education because they have to support their family, things like that. But I do think that that advice is advice that works for everybody in the sense of, how do you support people is if you can find out what their aspirations are and help them achieve them. All these quotes are excerpts from various commencement speeches given by, very well-known people. And I found, by investigating these commencement speeches that there's generally two kinds of advice. One is go out and do something for society, right? Don't be selfish, do something for society. And then the second one is go and chase your dreams, go and chase your aspirations. And so with that, I will end and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think people who are interested to ask questions can raise their hand so that we can moderate.
It looks like Rajesh has a question in chat.
Okay, you can take that first, I think.
Let's see. So Rajesh is asking, should an aspiration need to be bound within a constraint of values? Otherwise, isn't human aspiration central cause of environmental degradation unless you consider aspiration isn't in the same continuum as greed? Yeah, great. I think that's a terrific question. So, again, this is conjecture, but here's my claim. I believe that over time, as people achieve their aspirations and feel confident that they can achieve them, that they find new aspirations, and those newer aspirations tend to become over time more and more pro-social and transcendent, right? I completely agree with you that environmental degradation is, in fact, many of the problems we're facing right now on the earth are a direct result of the fact that I think as a human population, our primary aspiration is to be wealthier and to consume more stuff, right? And that is definitely the reason why we're in this pickle. But I also think the way out is for more of us to grow out of that and to act on the aspiration to really, provide for, others as well as for the future, for future human beings that are not even yet born. The big question I think that leaves for, for researchers, people like us, is how do you get more people who appear to have met their, material needs off of that ongoing aspiration? So one of the things that's really interesting to me is, there are some very successful CEOs in this world who seem to have no end to their greedy aspirations, right? Like, I'm sure we can all name those kinds of people. And then there are also some CEOs who decide once they achieve a certain level of success, they're like, okay, I'm done with this. I'm now going to focus on my foundation, or I'm now going to work on philanthropic causes, or I'm now going to, lobby for, for sustainable, for more sustainable policies. And, one of the biggest questions for me is what's the differentiating factor between those two groups, right? I mean, we live in a world where if you're a billionaire, you really don't need to chase after more income, right? And so why are there some billionaires who still feel the need to do that and who seem stuck on one level of their aspiration? And what causes other people to move on? And I think that's a really interesting question. And in many ways, I think probably a certain kind of reflection is required, and we need mechanisms that kind of that really encourage that reflection, especially among people who have achieved a certain level of success.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Dibendu has a question.
Very good evening, Professor. This is Dibendu here from Abu Dhabi. I'm so honored that yes, we are getting something very inspirational and very much the motivational from you. My thing is that, means my question, that if needs and aspirations both can be termed as like, one on another, or it will be so distinctive. And if it is so distinctive, so how we can put a thin demarcation line in between these two? That is my first question. And
Great,
the second
thank you.
question is that, yeah, and the second
Right.
question is that how the emotional state and spiritual state can transform and can be tempted to go beyond the aspirations in the negative way and to become so unethical. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. So let me, if I understand the first question, you're asking, is there really, in fact, a sufficient differentiation between needs and aspirations? Is that right? Yeah. So that's a great
Right.
question. Again, a lot of this, I follow the intuition that Abraham Maslow had. Oftentimes, people's aspirations are formed by the needs that they experienced a lot during their childhood, right? So, if you grew up in a family that was always hungry and couldn't always eat, then oftentimes your main aspiration as an adult becomes, I need to make enough money so that eating is not a problem, right? And on the other hand, many of us have grown up in families where we never had to worry about food, right? And so, but you might have heard from your parents, hey, you need to become an engineer so that you have a respectable job that other people will respect, and that will also earn a reasonable amount of status and so on. And so, if you hear that all the time and you think that's the thing that's missing in your life, then I think that becomes a dominant aspiration as an adult. I'll say that in my family, I was constantly told by my parents, we don't care what you do, but we want you to be the best at it, right? Which is a very kind of achievement-oriented thing. And I fully feel like I am in this achievement level of aspirations. Like, I'm driven by this desire to achieve things and to show the world that I can get things done, right? And so, yeah, I think aspirations in some ways are kind of needs, but needs expressed in a different way. They become more long-lasting, and so on. Having said that, I also think that as adults, we have the capacity to outgrow some of those things, especially, once we feel comfortable that we've achieved it. And so, even in my lifetime, very little by very little, my career has gone in a direction where I was really focused more on just, proving my intelligence to trying to find ways to help communities do better themselves. And, I still feel the tug of this desire to be recognized, for my intelligence, but over my, over multiple decades of my professional life, I feel like I've been able to let it go more and more. So that's how I see the interplay between needs and aspirations. Yeah, remind me your second question.
Yes, that is related to the spirituality and emotional, the temptedness. So
Yeah,
how
great.
one can, yes, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So you'll see on this kind of table that I have in the middle, Fowler's stages of faith. So this is a framework that was devised by a scholar of religion. And he had a Quaker and a Christian background, but he believed that, spirituality was a universal thing, and that you could show that there was such a thing as, spiritual development. And so he had 7 stages. I'm only showing kind of, 4 of them here, but he had 7 stages. And, again, as children, you go through many of these. And then often as an adult, you kind of slow down in terms of your development, and you tend to stay in one or two over your adult livelihood. And what's interesting about this is that, as you progress in your spirituality, there's a phase in which you believe spirituality is about following certain kinds of rules and rituals, and being committed to a particular set of rules. But as you become, as your spirituality develops more, you realize that the rules are just kind of heuristics, and that really there's an underlying philosophy about more compassion, being better to other people, and so on, that you're trying to enact. And then over time, that becomes, initially you understand that intellectually, but over time you understand it more and more emotionally, so that you naturally become more compassionate, more loving, and feel the world to be one entity, and so on. And I think that, I think that there's a similar kind of spiritual growth that happens both with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but also with, kind of mass transition in values, right? So again, if you're hungry all the time, it's very hard to be worried about being nice to other people. But if that's met, then some of those other values also become more and more visible to you.
Thank you, Professor. Thanks a lot for your great explanation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks for the questions.
Thank you. Any other question? I think there are some on the chart, but I don't know if they're questions or just appreciations. Yeah, I think there is a question from SK.
Yep, it says, how does a firm go about a new product design to come up with an aspirational future product? No, that's a good question. To be honest with you, I'm not convinced that that businesses are necessarily the best poised to cause this kind of aspirational growth through their products. But I do think that internally within organizations, within companies, there can be more deliberate ways of thinking in which the goal is to grow better employees and managers, but also better, more enlightened employees and managers and leaders. And I think, one of the interesting things about, strategic leadership is often, you can't be a completely selfish person and be a great leader, right? Like you always have to be you have to have an enlightened understanding of how, you're contributing to other people's welfare, whether it's your own employees or to, your customers or to your, to the larger society. And I think that's where some of this idea of aspirations can be thought through. So for example, any given company, there's certainly employees who are really focused on just making sure that they have a stable income, which is one level of aspiration. There's also employees who want, who are, like me, like they want recognition, and income is one thing, but the recognition is what derives them. And then, presumably there are some employees who really care about what the meaning of the company is and what the purpose is it contributing to a societal good. And so I think for each such group, there's different ways that you can, motivate them as a leader, but also different ways to kind of help them themselves grow as human beings that might also contribute in positive ways to the company. I think the challenge with selling people things is that it's hard in that instance to really engage with their, they have consumption aspirations, but it's hard to really move beyond just the exchange and the transaction, right? Because it's, most sales is a transaction. And so at least I haven't thought of a good framework for thinking about that side of things. But I do think, again, within organizations, there's plenty of interesting aspiration-related ways to think about it.
Thank you. Ankit, did you want to ask a question? Yeah, Ankit.
Yes. Thank you, sir. I wanted to know how would we identify the aspirations of the people, because we need to uncover the needs and then identify the underlying aspirations, and more so when we will be having our inherent biases. So how can we identify that?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. And I don't really have a great answer. I would say on this slide is a starting point. You can ask about, it took me a while to achieve this question. One of the important things is that you do want the person to think about something that they have some control over, right? Like I found that if you don't insert that part, then people sometimes will say things like, I wish I could win the lottery, right? Which is a great desire, but there's nothing that they can do about it other than buy more lottery tickets. And so it's not really an aspiration you can hook into. And then the other thing is that you want it to be something that causes change for themselves or their community in some form. And so that's where this, the middle part of this phrase is. And then finally, you want to ask about something that has some time element that is longer than, this today or next week or even next year. You want them to think about, how they think about their life over several years at least. I think in different contexts, then you have to think about, okay, how can we ask these questions in a way that really elicits the type of aspiration you're looking for? I will also say that in many very poor subsistence communities, it's actually very difficult to get people to talk about aspirations because they're afraid to hope, right? Like they're in a world in which just getting through the day every day is such a struggle that they don't want to hope for something better because then they'll just be disappointed. And they've learned that, over their lifetime. And so it's really hard to get them to express an aspiration. And in fact, arguably, it's even ethically problematic if you try to do it outside of some other framework. And so in those cases, I think, you may have to wait, like you may have to engage with the community and, help them achieve some of the goals that they have that are more immediate before you can really start asking about aspirations. And in my book, I talk about an NGO called Pradhan that works mostly in North India, but across the country. And they work with self-help groups in village communities. And that's kind of the way they operate, which is, they form a self-help group. They help the group, figure out what they want for themselves right then and there, and then help that group achieve what they want, whether it's like, growing mango trees or whatever. And then once they get to a certain point, then they start asking, okay, what more do you think you want from your life? And that's where, some of the aspirations come.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think there are no more questions. Thank you very much. Is there any more question?
Hello?
Hello? I think that's a noise. All right. Thank you very much, Professor. I think for me, at least, this distinction between need and aspiration wasn't that clear. And I always thought need is something that we should focus. And with your explanation, I got to know, need is not something that actually can achieve the kind of social change that we are desiring. And the social change probably is more based on aspirations rather than on need. Thank you very much for that. And thanks for agreeing to come here. And thanks, Ramendra, for pulling in him here. And thanks, Professor. And we will be in touch. And let's see if we can do something more in future on this from the Management Center for Human Values. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending the talk. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.